The last light slipped behind the red bluffs, and I rode into dry willow with winter dust salted into my coat and the kind of tired that makes a man count his joints. 6 years alone had planed me down to plain boards, hands to work, back to carry. A thin strip of duty kept me walking when the wind pushed the other way. People say time heals. Time does not heal. Work distracts. Silence hardens, and the ache sets like a knot in seasoned wood that will not plane out no matter how you sharpen the blade. You learn to carry that knot. You do not learn to sing. The cabin sat where cottonwoods thinned, and the wash cut a shallow line through my claim. I saw smoke before I saw the door. A thin blue thread climbed into the cold, the color of a vein under a wrist. I had not lit any fire that morning. Judas, my horse, tossed his head, and the bit rang against his teeth. I swung down. The ground was frost hard. The little sounds carried far in that kind of air. A twig clicked once. A nail in the eave ticked. Nothing else. I eased the latch. Warmth met me like a hand to the face. The iron stove glowed. The table stood where I had left it. The chair waited with its joints complaining. On the cot lay a woman. She was awake and watching me, eyes dark and steady. Her hair fell black across the blanket. A buckskin dress hung loose, where hunger had been the tailor. Bruises tracked her wrists and cheek. She did not plead. She measured. I knew that look, and I knew that people. Chiricahua Apache, if I was any judge. Years back I had scouted along the San Carlos and learned more than trail signs. I learned what pride looks like when chased. I learned how a territory can grind a person down without ever saying a word. I stood in the door with the heat on my face and the cold chewing the back of my neck. A dozen thoughts jostled. Drag her out and bar the door. Let the night finish what someone else started. Safer. Simpler. The valley had taught me such arithmetic. But another thought rose up and would not sit down. I saw Mary again in her last hours, and the small mound beside hers where our boy lay. I remembered a hand going slack in mine. I remembered the sound the house made after. I am not much for words. When words go, the hands remain. I set bread on the table and pushed the plate toward the cot. Then I poured water and placed the tin cup so she could reach it without rising. She moved like a deer that has learned the language of traps. Careful, exact. The blanket slipped from one shoulder and showed the rope marks. She tore the bread in small bites. Her throat worked like it hurt to swallow. I sat on the stool. We watched the fire. The stove ticked like an old clock. I touched 2 fingers to my chest. Boone. She mirrored the gesture to her own chest. A single word. Nasha. I'm. The name held a round river sound. I nodded. No more talk. Talk was not the thing we needed. We needed decisions. I said one word in a voice I used when gentling a colt and when burying my dead. Stay. She did not nod, and she did not smile. She drew the blanket up and lowered herself back to the cot as if laying down a wager. I stepped outside and split wood until the swing and bite of the axe ate the questions. When I came in again, she had not moved. I saw where the door frame had splintered. She had forced the latch with a stick or a stone. That told its own story. Desperation will teach a person carpentry of the wrong kind. I warmed beans with jerky and a pinch of coffee thrown in. She ate with a steadier hand. I set a second log in the stove. I pulled my chair near the door. The rifle rested where my hand could find it without asking the eye for help. Night pushed against the chinks. Wind searched for ways to come in and found fewer than it wanted. Twice she woke and checked if I was still there. Twice I lifted my chin to say yes without speaking. Morning made the frost glitter in the window. What needed choosing felt chosen. I would not put her back into the dark. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you do not, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. We set a language of small work. I lifted the bucket and showed her the swing a wrist makes when a person means creek. She stood on bare feet and breathed through the hurt. The seam at her neckline had ripped, and she held it together with the blanket. We walked the narrow path where willow roots gripped the bank. At the water she hissed at the cold and did not pull away. We carried the full bucket together. my hand on the handle and her hand on top of mine, not to take it but to keep the weight honest between us. Back at the cabin I checked the door. I cut a new mortise and trued a scrap of cedar for a bar. She watched and learned the shape of the work. When I set the chisel down, she picked up my coat without asking and threaded a bone needle I kept in a tin. She stitched the tear near the elbow. The line wandered and held. That is a fair description of most salvation. By noon, the day had a high quiet. The hawk wrote lazy letters over the wash. I weighed the need for flour and salt against the risk of leaving her alone. In the end, a man must eat, and a stove must have oil. I saddled Judas. At the door she stood with the blanket clasped. I lifted my hand with the palm toward her, the way you tell a horse to stand. She gave a small nod. The kind a person uses when they promise themselves before they promise you. Sagebrush Crossing looked the same and looked different. That is what happens when a man starts caring again. The false fronts tried to look tall. The church leaned. The saloon did not. I bought what I needed and kept my hat brim low. Jackson Crowley hung his elbows on a wagon wheel and spat a news seed at me. Heard a pair from down San Simon way are sniffing around about a runaway Apache gal. Say she stole. Boys are mean as hornets and smarter than hornets only by accident. Keep your gate closed. I keep my own counsel, I said. I took the long track home. The chimney smoked just right. Inside the coat lay folded on the chair back. The floor had been swept with a willow broom I had never used well. The room felt occupied instead of invaded. It was the first time since Mary died that the second plate on my table was not a ghost. We ate. The silence changed shape. It set like good mortar between bricks. It held. That night I sat with the rifle and cleaned it by lamplight. She balanced the spoon end to end on the table for no other reason than to make order where she could. The blanket slipped off one shoulder and she pulled it back up without hurry. I saw the skin and the bruises because I am a man with eyes and a past. I looked away because I am a man who wants to live with himself in the morning. She did not flinch, and she did not barter. We let the coals sink red. I slept and did not dream. That is its own kind of mercy. Morning starts plain in a country like ours. Smoke went straight up and the sky wore that hard blue that makes a nail look bright. I brewed coffee strong and set a cup where her hands could find it without asking. She cradled it with both palms and closed her eyes. Relief will write itself across a face even when the person has learned to keep the rest of the ledger hidden. I had fences to mend along the wash and snares to check. Before I stepped out, I showed her the Henry lever rifle and made the motions slow. Load here. Work the action here. Keep the muzzle as honest as a preacher on Sunday. She tilted her head and repeated each move until the sound of the bolt was clean. Then she set the rifle back and lifted both hands to show she understood the rule. No shooting unless a coyote came bold. Halfway down the fence line, I heard hooves moving like men who believed the road belonged to their boots. I dropped behind Prickly Pear and watched two riders go by. They wore hats that kept rain off a lie. I waited a long count after their dust drifted east before I moved. I took a back draw home. Judas picked his feet like a cat. Inside the cabin, Nasha had her hair braided to one side and sat mending her own dress. She read the news in my face the way a scout reads, a set of tracks across rock. One word from her, and it was the right one. Men. Maybe, I said. I checked the rifle and spoke slow so shape could carry more meaning than grammar. Bad. Looking. She laid 2 fingers on the rope, scars at her wrists. She did not lower her eyes. She stood straighter. Courage is quiet. It shows up to work. I barred the shutters and laid another stick in the stove. We waited through a long afternoon that made each small noise seem large. Wind came down from the high country and shouldered the roof. I could smell snow even in the desert. Snow and trouble make their own kind of cover. We ate beans and salt pork. She rinsed the plates and set them to dry by the window. Twice she went to the glass and pressed her palm to the cold. She looked to the cottonwoods where the creek hooked left. I knew then she had not crawled into my bed by accident. She had chosen this notch in the land because something in it looked like a place a person might make a stand without being swallowed whole. Night set its table. I cleaned the colt until the clicks lined up like good manners. She sat near the stove and hummed a tune the land might have taught her. The notes rose and fell like a ridgeline in low light. We spoke only enough to keep fear from learning the room. Then the sound came clean. Hooves in, wet. A lantern rattle. She moved to the shadow behind the bed. I stood square with my shoulders rolled down and the rifle up. The knock rattled the latch. Boone Ashford, we hear you are keeping what does not belong to you. There is nothing here that fits your words. Make it easy. Girl is property. Papers in town say so. Paper will bless a theft quicker than it will bless a birth when whiskey stands the witness. I did not open the door. You boys climb off my step. Come daybreak ride to Sagebrush and show your papers to the judge. Until then, find another fire. A quiet followed. It was the kind that tastes like oil on the tongue. The first kick shook the door. The second split the latch I had fixed. The third pushed a man through. He held a lantern and a pistol. He was slow by a heartbeat, and I was not. The rifle barked, and the room filled with smoke and lamp stink. The second man fired, and his bullet bit the log to my right. My next shot put him against the jamb. Silence afterward carried a hiss from the broken lamp and the quick breath of a person who had watched their life stand up again. I dragged both bodies into the sleet. The weather pulled a sheet over them while I barred the door. When I turned, she walked from the shadows and set her palm on my chest. It was not a lover's claim. It was a placing of trust, where a man keeps his word. Safe, I said, and I meant it farther than the walls. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second, and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you are listening from, so I do not feel so alone out here. Morning laid a clean face across a night with ugly bones. I stepped out and read the ground. The storm had eaten most of the tracks. Inside, I bled the stove and brewed coffee. I only then felt the pull under my ribs. A splinter of lead had kissed me without getting its way. She saw the stain and moved with the gentle authority of someone who has learned to bind the world back together with cloth and patience. She heated water and cleaned the crease. Her hands were steady and her eyes were steady. She spoke in her tongue, and I knew the meaning, though not the words. Stay alive. Do not make me choose the road without you. We passed that day inside a circle of small tasks. I set a new hinge on the door, and she laid beans to soak with a sliver of pork. She watched the window more than once. I kept the rifle where my hand could find it without looking. Trouble rarely returns the next night, but pride can drive men to foolish repeats. Pride was thick in this country. Near sundown, I took her to the creek and showed her where the bank undercut left. Good for snares when the thaw ran stronger. She wore my old wool coat with the sleeves rolled back. She turned her face to the wind like a deer that has learned the exact distance between fear and freedom. She spoke a single word: home. I have heard hymns in churches from Kansas to Sonora. None sounded truer. We stood with the bluffs red against the west. I felt a slow unwinding in the ribs where a man keeps the future he is willing to believe. Back in the cabin, I fetched a second chair from the shed and set it by the table. I had left it out there since Mary. Rooms can feel smaller when you bring the right things into them. They can feel more honest, too. Nasha ran her hand over the back rail and found the shallow scratches a boy's knife had made. She did not ask, and I did not tell. Some roads you do not walk in the dark. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you. That night we slept inside a quiet that did not feel empty. The fire breathed. The house breathed. 2 people breathed. It is a simple arithmetic. It changes everything. The next day the snow went to ground and the wash talked as if telling the county a story it had been holding all winter. I had to ride to town. Flour ran low. Lamp oil was honest about its end. A man who shoots men on his step should also make sure the law hears more than rumor. Names matter. Names can prevent a bigger storm. Before I left, I showed her again how the Henry worked and where to stand to keep the doorway from becoming a target. She learned fast. She set the rifle back and touched the white line of bandage under my shirt with a look that asked if this was wise. I told her the truth that keeps me breathing. Cannot live penned. Not you. Not me. Town sounded like a place I used to know. I bought what I came to buy. Crowley found me by the hitch rail and leaned into the kind of talk that draws flies. 2 men from San Simon are missing. Rode out bragging about a catch. Did not ride back. Sheriff may want to know what you heard. Verse 7. The storm took a bite out of many things. Or a bullet did. Be careful, Boone. I rode home with my head up and my hands quiet. At the cabin she had set the table for two with small care. The spoon lay like a compass. She looked as if she had been listening to the weather for words. I told her what little mattered. I did not speak the names I did not have. I spoke the danger. She nodded like a partner taking a watch shift, not like a person being protected. That week settled into a shape that could be called life without scaring it away. She sang soft when she worked. I sharpened tools and pointed out where the cow trail cut rock so deep a horse could find it by feel. She taught me the word for coyote and the word for enough. Both served us daily. I taught her a card game suited for 2 souls and 1 stove. My joke about preachers did not earn a smile, and that suited me fine. At night, we traded pieces of our old lives, in the careful way people trade glass. She told me how men with rope hearts had pulled her from her people's winter camp, how a fence and a brand and a ledger had been used like scripture to explain a theft, how whiskey had loosened a hand and she had run. She followed water because water keeps a secret, and because a person who follows green can sometimes find mercy. I told her about Mary and the way a man keeps a good woman alive without embalming her in sorrow, how she salted bread with the exact pinch her mother taught, how she tied her hair when a wind came up from the south, how the fever took her and our boy. I said the boy's name once, and then let it rest. There are words you do not carry around the room. The first time she took my hand, it was not for love. It was to pull me away from the door when a jay barked alarm from the cottonwoods. We stood with our backs to the wall and the rifles angled. A mule deer slid through the clearing and flashed white without giving us any sermon. We laughed. The room learned how to hold that sound without dropping it. Later we kissed. Not because fear demanded a tax, because choice invited a step. I asked with my eyes. She answered by closing the last space. The kiss was not young, and it was not over-hungry. It was clear. That is how 2 stubborn rivers decide to meet and make a third. We did not set rules with ink. We set them with habits. We cooked and ate and washed the plates. We slept with our shoulders touching and our own thoughts intact. The rifle leaned where it always had. That night, it watched a house at peace. The sun made an honest color of the dark earth, and I rode a quiet perimeter, the axe's rhythm now serving as punctuation for a life planned to stay. She met my return with eyes that asked no questions, and that night, watching her trace a circle on the table, I knew we were trading straight lines for a story that intended to turn. Spring began the only way spring knows in a country that wears rock-like armor. The thaw pried at the ground. The cottonwoods put out a first thread of green. We mended fence because men who intend to live must mend fence no matter what the poets write. We stacked wood because the next winter always stands somewhere in the room waiting its turn. I saddled Judas for a ride to the South Ridge to look at water and grass. She walked beside me and asked about roads I had ridden before we met. I pointed out where the trail bent and why. No romance dressed the talk. 2 travelers compared notes. That kind of talk makes a fair foundation. On the ridge we found coyote sign and the clean track of a small band of antelope. She knelt and read the ground with a hunter's eye. I watched and learned. I have never believed a man's dignity depends on being the only person in the room who knows a thing. My dignity stands on whether I keep learning while my knees still bend. We spoke of leaving. There is a piece of ground south of the Gila where the soil holds water a little longer, and a person can grow corn high enough to shade a dog. We spoke of staying. Dry Willow had already taken our measure and not spit us out. We rolled both coins in the firelight. Neither of us tried to buy the other with gratitude. Gratitude shines. Chains shine too. We wanted rope for building, not rope for binding. If you are watching on TV, do not hesitate. Grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you will never miss out on our amazing characters. We made a garden where the sun kept its promise. We hauled stones for a small wall that would trip the wind. We built a pen for a goat. Crowley sold me at a price that said rumor may not be the only language he speaks. She learned how to set a rabbit snare that would not take the wrong neck. I learned a song line in her tongue that meant enough and safe and food in the same breath depending on how a person carried the sound. Language is a kind of tool. It cuts a door if you hold it right. One afternoon a rider's dust lifted on the west trail, and I felt that old cold thought sit up. I set the rifle on the sill and told her to keep low and to watch the cottonwood gap. The rider turned out to be a young cowboy with a busted cinch and a mouth full of apologies. We helped him tape leather to leather and sent him on with a flask of coffee. He looked back twice as he rode. People look when they see a thing that does not fit their easy stories. Let them look. We were not a story for their comfort. Night brought a soft south wind that smelled like wet iron and green. We sat by the door with our boots off and let the day cool on our faces. She leaned her head to my shoulder and asked a question that could have been a trap in another house and was not in mine. Why you choose me? I answered the only way a man should who intends to keep looking himself in the eye. Because you chose you first, then you chose me. That is a kind of love I can live under without feeling small. She drew a long breath and let it go. We turned our heads toward the dark and listened to the wash tell its version of the world. No violins, no declarations, just two people who had learned the worth of asking and the worth of answering. That night the air cooled slow, dragging the scent of sage and damp earth through the cracks of the cabin. The lantern burned low, throwing our shadows wide against the walls we had built with our own calloused hand. I watched her braid her hair by the firelight, each twist calm and sure. The small rhythm of survival turned ritual. Out there, somewhere, the world still bit and tore. But in that little room we were a kind of quiet proof that mercy could last longer than the gun that made it. When the wick hissed out, I lay awake listening to coyotes call across the wash. Their voices rose and fell in the dark like memory itself, never staying, never gone. She stirred beside me and whispered something soft in her tongue. I didn't know the words, but I felt what she meant. Some prayers don't need translation. Morning broke gold and hard. I rode the fence line alone, the saddle creaking beneath me, the sun clawing over the ridge. A hawk wheeled overhead, lazy in its hunger. The earth still carried the chill of night, but the soil under the hooves felt alive. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw smoke curling from the chimney and her figure in the doorway, a shawl over her shoulders. For a heartbeat, it looked like a painting of a life I'd stopped believing a man like me could deserve. She waved once, small and sure, and I knew then the shape of belonging wasn't chains or vows. It was the simple knowledge that someone wanted you back when you rode home. That afternoon, I fixed the hinge on the gate, and she brought water from the creek. We worked without speaking. The rhythm of metal and splash, hammer and breath, said enough. Later, when the sun leaned west, we sat on the porch with coffee gone cold, watching the sky bleed from blue to rust. A line of cranes cut through the air high above, heading toward places we'd never see. She asked what I was thinking. About how far a man can travel without moving, I said. She smiled, eyes half closed. You travel plenty sitting here. I nodded. Guess so. Used to think the world ended at the edge of the hills. Now I think it just begins wherever a person stops running. She set her cup down, leaned her head to my shoulder, and said, Then you begin now. The wind picked up, cool against our faces, and somewhere a cottonwood leaf turned over, silver side catching light. I remember thinking that maybe that was what grace looked like, not a miracle, not forgiveness, just a single leaf deciding to show its other side and not be ashamed. That evening, we mended the last tear in her old buckskin dress. I told her I could ride to town, trade for new cloth. She shook her head. Not yet. This one knows my skin. When she finished the final stitch, she said quietly, You and me same now. We keep what life gave, not what life took. I didn't answer. Just watched her fingers knot the thread and bite it off clean. Outside, the coyotes had gone silent, as if even they were listening. Before sleep took us, I stepped to the door and looked out at the horizon. The stars had come clear, the kind of sharp you only get after rain. I thought of every road I'd ever taken, all the dust, all the noise, and how none of it had led me to peace, until a woman half-starved and half-wild broke my latch and made my cabin into something like a heart again. When I turned back, she was already asleep, one arm across the empty half of the bed that wasn't empty anymore. I lay down beside her, and the last thing I heard before sleep was the steady pulse of her breath matching mine, like two metronomes finally finding the same beat. Outside, the land waited quiet, wide, alive, holding its breath for spring to stand up and take its first step. Spring stood up in full and took a step. The wash ran bright. The cottonwoods wore a young shade like hope that had learned not to brag. We rode to the west shoulder of land where the wind forgot to chew so hard. I carried a shovel and a small sack of stones. She carried rosemary from the edge of the creek. We set a cairn, and I spoke the name I had carried in my chest like a hot coin. She set it back with exact care. We did not cry. The ground is not healed by tears. It is healed by the hands that keep working after the tears have gone. We looked at each other straight. A person who has been owned learns to read the fine print even when there is no ink. I said what needed saying. We are free people. We stay because we choose. We go because we choose. If that changes for either of us, we part without debt or theft and without lie. She took my hand and squeezed once. The answer fit the promise. We laid out rows for beans and corn. We hung a strip of windbell from old spoons on the porch. We learned how to sleep without keeping the rifle tight to the chest. That is not to say we forgot danger. We set a line of dry brush at the edge of the clearing that would whisper a warning to a watchful ear. We did not hide from the world. We prepared to live inside it without giving ourselves away. On a day that looked like any other, she came back from the creek with trout on a willow loop. She sat on the step with sun in her hair and a look that belonged to a person who has decided that the next breath is worth what it costs. She said my name whole and smiled small. Boone Ashford. I thought a plain thought and kept it, the way a farmer keeps a seed for the right soil. I could die tomorrow and know I have lived again. Not because a bed is warm, though it is, and rightly so, because my roof holds a second heartbeat that chose to beat there. We spoke that evening of the Gila again, and of dry willow again. We did not reach a conclusion, and we did not try to force one. Some choices ripen. A man who has learned impatience from grief must learn patience from love. We went inside. I set the lamp low. She set the plates. We ate. We cleaned up. I reached for her hand. She leaned in. The kiss that night tasted like bread and river, and the line a plow leaves when it first turns a field that has rested too long. If you have made it this far, I know you are a true fan of WWL. Morning came honest. We harnessed Judas to a travois and hauled fence posts from a stand of cedar on the north rise. We worked side by side until sweat salted our shirts. Work is its own sacrament when two people do it without scorekeeping. We rested in the shade of a cottonwood and shared a canteen and a strip of jerky. She dozed with her head in my lap. The breeze moved her hair. I set my palm there gentle, and thanked to God I do not claim to understand that I was allowed this plain mercy. We closed the day at the cairn. The rosemary had taken to the soil. The new shoots looked like little green hands. We stood quiet. Then we walked back with the sun making long shadows that did not frighten us. The cabin waited with its oiled latch and its scrubbed table and its second chair that had found its way home. The rifle leaned and did not mind that it had become an instrument of last resort instead of a first language. This is a story about healing that does not lie about scars. It is a story about freedom that does not confuse loneliness with liberty. It is a story about trust that puts two sets of feet on the same floor and asks them to move in rhythm without stepping on the other. It is not perfect, neither are we. It is human, and it is open, and it is ours. The trail runs west like a dare, and south like a promise. We will ride one or the other when the season and our hearts agree. Until then, we will water the row. We will mend the fence. We will keep the door oiled, so that a person who needs mercy can open without breaking it. The nights after that turned softer, as if the land itself had forgiven us for surviving. The wind still came down from the ridges, but it carried more music than bite. When I lay awake, I could hear the wash running steady, and Nasha's breathing keeping time with it. She always slept light, like someone who'd been chased too long to trust silence. Some nights, when she stirred, I'd murmur, "You're safe." She never answered with words, just reached across the space between us until her fingers brushed mine, and that was answer enough. By early summer, the desert wore a strange beauty, not green like a river country, but painted in rust and sage. She said it was the color of endurance. "Pretty never stay," she told me one morning while she hung wet clothes by the line. "Strong stay." I liked that. Out here, everything that stayed was strong. We started working the soil proper, turning earth that hadn't been touched since the world was young. She taught me how to plant corn in small mounds instead of straight rows, so the rain gathered better. I taught her how to oil the plow blade, how to check the harness so Judas didn't pull raw. Each lesson went both ways, her past and mine, building something that didn't belong to either alone. When the first shoots pushed up, I felt a quiet pride I hadn't known since before the fever took my family. She stood beside me, dirt on her hands, sweat on her brow, eyes steady on that green. "We make new life," she said. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought maybe we had. Late one afternoon, a rider passed by, dust-caked, lean, the kind of man who never learned to knock. He asked for water. I poured him a tin cup and watched him drink. His eyes moved from me to Nasha and back again. "Didn't think I'd see a sight like that this far north," he said, voice flat but heavy with meaning. "You sure know how to live dangerous, mister." I set my hand on the table, fingers near the rifle but not on it. "I live honest," I said. "That's danger enough for some." He shrugged, finished his drink, and set the cup down slow. "World's changing," he said. "Not always for better." "Maybe not," I told him. "But we still get to decide which part we are." He nodded, half respectful, half confused, then rode on. Nasha watched him go, shoulders tense until he disappeared. "Many like him," she whispered. "Yes," I said, "but not all of them." That evening, I found her outside, sitting by the corral with a piece of willow in her hands, carving lines with a small bone knife. I asked what she was making. She didn't look up. "Memory stick," she said. "We carve when we live through bad times. To remember, not to fear." She handed it to me. I traced the grooves, circles, lines, marks like rivers meeting. "What's this one?" I asked. She pointed. "This river. Us." Then she pressed her thumb against my chest. "You carve next." I didn't know how to carve the way she did, so I burned my mark in the wood with a hot nail. It wasn't much, but she smiled. "Now both stay," she said. The next day, clouds rolled in from the south, thick and gray. Rain hit the roof heavy and quick. We stayed inside, mending gear and talking low. The air smelled of dust and coffee and the faint oil of the rifle I'd cleaned that morning. When thunder cracked, she flinched not from fear of the sound, but from what memory hides inside noise. I set the cup down and crossed to her. "It's just weather," I said softly. She looked up. "Not weather in here," she said, tapping her temple. "Storm's still there sometimes." I nodded. "I got one too." She smiled faintly, then leaned her head against my chest. We stayed like that a long time, the storm outside hammering against the walls, while the one inside both of us eased a little. When morning came, the world smelled new. The rain had washed the dust from the mesquite and left the air sweet. The field glistened, the corn taller, the soil dark as promise. Nasha stepped barefoot into the mud, laughing, her skirt wet to the knees. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh without restraint. It was low, rich, and full of something I hadn't known could live here anymore. "You sound like the land," I said. She tilted her head. "Then you love land again?" I looked at her, this woman who had broken into my cabin and somehow built a home there, and said, "Yeah, I reckon I do." That afternoon, she asked to ride Judas alone. I hesitated but handed her the reins. "Just the ridge," I said. "No farther. You tubbling duck." She nodded and rode out, hair streaming in the wind, body straight in the saddle like she'd been born to it. I watched until she became a blur against the hills. When she returned, she was quiet for a long time before she said, "I saw where the river bends west. Someday we go there." "Someday," I said. We didn't talk about leaving again that summer. The land was kind, the work steady, and the nights warm enough to sleep with the door open. Sometimes I'd wake and see her sitting on the porch, watching the stars. "What do you see out there?" I asked once. "People who gone before," she said. "They see us back. Does that make you sad?" She shook her head. "No, make me brave." Autumn came slow, gold creeping through the leaves. We harvested the corn together, the stalks taller than her shoulders. The smell of smoke and sweet earth filled the air. We laid the cobs in the shed, stacked neat and proud. "First harvest," I said. She smiled. "Not last." That night we cooked with what we grew, beans and roasted corn, and sat on the porch as the sky turned violet. I told her about the time my father taught me how to break a Mustang with patience instead of pain. She told me how her people sang to the horses, not to command them, but to ask permission. "You and me same," she said. "Different songs, same asking." When the chill returned to the air, I fixed the roof again, this time with her help. We worked until dark, then sat by the fire, tired and content. She traced the scar on my shoulder where the bullet had grazed me months before. "Still hurt?" she asked. "Not when you touch it," I said. She laughed softly, and the sound felt like home. One night, before winter's first frost, we buried the memory stick under the cottonwood near the cairn. "So, ground remember," she said. "If we go, land still know our story." I looked down at the dirt covering the small piece of carved wood. "Think anyone'll ever find it?" She smiled. "Maybe. Maybe they need to." We walked back hand in hand, the stars sharp above us, the air thin and clear. Inside, the cabin glowed warm, two shadows moving together against the wall. That's the truth of it, not the gunfire or the snow or the blood, but the quiet after, the work of rebuilding a soul one dawn at a time, the kind of love that doesn't cage you, doesn't rescue you, just stands beside you while you heal. I reckon that's what the frontier really was, not the edge of the world, but the edge of the heart, where you either learn mercy or you die mean. And we chose mercy. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment "Amen" below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life. I saved a Navajo girl in the desert. Then the hunter became the hunted. The land out past Dry Creek was quiet that spring. Still cold at night, but dry enough for fence work. I'd been alone out there for most of the season, just me, my tools, and the slow rhythm of rebuilding what time and wind had worn down. My ranch wasn't big, just a square of hard-baked land tucked along the base of the Red Hills. A patch of earth too dry for corn, but good enough for grazing when you kept things modest. That's how I liked it. Modest, predictable, no debts, no visitors. At 45, I'd lived more years in silence than in company. I remembered riding with scouts back when the Indian conflicts were winding down and the territory still ran hot with raids and revenge. I lost a friend to one of those rides. Wrong place, wrong time. We were guiding a Navajo elder, a man named Hoka, through a treaty promising peace, a promise broken with the first gunshot. And though I never blamed Hoka's people for it, I never quite forgave myself. After that, I stopped chasing meaning and started building fences. No one could die from fence posts and dry cattle. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The world out here was brutal and beautiful, a landscape of contradictions. The red earth could swallow a man whole, but the sunsets painted the sky in a way that would break your heart with their beauty. It was a place where honor was earned, not given, and a man's word was a bond as strong as any chain. I had tried to forget the violence, to bury the man I once was beneath a layer of dust and solitude. But the land never let you forget. The wind whispered secrets, and the silence echoed with the ghosts of the past. I was stretching wire along the southern edge of my land when I heard it, a sound sharp enough to break through the hum of wind and hoof flies. Not cattle, not birds, something human and in pain. I straightened up, waited. There it was again, a yell, quick, muffled, followed by the clatter of a runaway buckboard and a chorus of angry curses. My gut tightened. This wasn't a lost traveler or a drunken cowboy. This was trouble. I unlooped the reins from the post, climbed onto my bay gelding, and kicked toward the dry gulch.